Lesisha Kganyago, the governor of the Reserve Bank. He's announced that the repo rate has been cut by 25 basis points. And of course, on the left-hand side of your screen, just a moment ago, we continue to keep a track of Pravin Gordhan's funeral. Proceedings have ended at the Durban, the convention centre, and therefore the procession is now going to be heading to Reservoir Hills, where the remains of Pravin Gordhan will be cremated in a private ceremony. But of course, we will be keeping a track on that. Now back to the issue of the repo rate. That is down by 25 basis points. To get some analysis on this, I'm joined in studio by Mandisa Zavala. She's the head of asset allocations at AlexForbes. Annaline van der Poel, she's the COO of Debt Rescue. And Xhanti Payi, who's joining us virtually. He's an economist at PwC. Ladies, thank you very much for joining us. And Xhanti, online, thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps I can start with you, Mandisa. 25 basis points. Of course, the Reserve Bank governor was asked why not 50 basis, and he said they look at the risks. Their decisions are based on the risks. Do you think that's fair?
I mean, 100%, right? They have the data. They do a lot of work in the background to come to the decision, and also it's a committee. I think one of the comments that he made was that it was actually a unanimous decision. How that feeds into the economy is a completely different question, because also I think he notes that a lot of the information that we get in terms of inflation is also backward looking. So they need to account for certain risks that probably may not necessarily be in the system as yet. One of the things that he spoke about is global risks and rising geopolitical risks, which continue to become factors with regards to inflation going forward, especially headline. Fuel prices continue to go up. If we have another war, what does that mean? So I think, on the basis of everything, one of the things that, Governor Lesisha says is, their mandate is not to look at rates. Their mandate is inflation. Yeah. So a lot of the conversations he has is always around where's inflation going as opposed to rates. And I think that's why I would say, it's enough from that perspective. Again, what it means for the end user is obviously a completely different question. Yeah.
Annaline, you've been at the forefront of, dealing with those consumers who've been bitten hard by the high interest rate environment. Of course, in the whole rate hike cycle, the Reserve Bank upped interest rates nearly by 5 percentage points, and each of those points were hard every time they raised rates. It's a 25 basis point cut, not much relative to that nearly 5 percentage point increase. But what sort of impact do you think this will have on the consumer?
Well, absolutely. And obviously we're incredibly thankful to finally see it going in the downward direction. Is it enough? No, it's not. For the average consumer out there, this might be a few £100 extra in their pocket, but we have to factor in that, if a consumer breaks their budget down into its simplest form, and you look at expenses and you look at debt, expenses have increased, as have their debt repayments. Their debt repayments may have stabilized, but they've stabilized at these incredibly high interest rates. And on the expense side, because of inflation, that has just kept going up. So cost of living has risen. And even though it's slowing down, every single month it does continue to increase. So for the average consumer, it might be a few £100 back in their pocket, depending on the kind of debt exposure they have. But is it enough? No. I mean, they are struggling severely financially to actually literally put food on the table every month.
Indeed. Xhanti, I'm just looking to bring you in now. The governor talking in positive terms about the direction of inflation, but raising the issue that there still remain some upside risks. Your thoughts about what he was saying about the risks, and do you think that we need to worry about those risks?
Yeah, good afternoon. It's really good to be with you. I thought that was an interesting thing because he almost enriches the conversation a little bit more. So he talks really about the external risks, especially those geopolitical risks that you're seeing. And I suspect he's talking about the Middle East potential conflicts that could have a serious impact on oil prices in particular. It's something that in recent days has accelerated. We know the issues around the conflict with Israel that could actually be part of the regional conflict. So I think he's specifically speaking about that. But then he says something that I thought was interesting in the sense that, as he says, there are lots of moving parts. We see food inflation sort of quite volatile. It's probably something that they're concerned about in terms of headline inflation, and that's something that's of concern, even though it has come down over the long term. But I thought that the interesting thing that he said was how he looks at that we are, if we look at the US, how they've cut interest rates, and he says, well, we are not targeting interest rates, we are targeting inflation. And so we have to look at the inflation differential. And that's something that's quite interesting because also we know there's been that discussion around anchoring the inflation at 3%. So basically bring it closer to what the US and Europe and the rest of our trading partners might look like. So there are those kinds of moving parts, the kind of conversation that's actually quite more nuanced, and it's difficult really to single out one key thing that might inform the decision today. But you can see that there's a number of factors that we would have to go through, and it must be quite a rich discussion there because there's a lot of things that we looked at and we said, well, maybe this gives us some opportunity for 50 basis points, and then he says, well, actually maybe not, because that's not what we are looking at. This is what we are looking at. And that's probably how we're going to have to look at things going forward, is really the complexity of the environment in which we are in, both locally and internationally.
Yeah. Mandisa, one of the things the governor spoke to was growth. Of course, he always speaks about growth. The expectation is that growth is going to be lifted, but he's still saying that over the medium term, it's still going to be below 2% on average. Not great, but of course, he does talk about a lack of investment.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a key problem. I think that's a key problem for South Africa. It's a structural issue that we've had. They talk about, I think towards the end of his speech, he talks about that we need to make strides towards, essentially kind of getting a lot of that right in order to sustainably sort of have a positive, growth trajectory. Again, I think, in the past he has spoken about the fact that, growth is a thought when they sit down and look at, inflation forecasts, but their primary mandate again is around inflation. The lack of investment is a real thing. I think currently at the moment we have seen a bit of pickup and expectations to actually have that improve on the back of some of the things that are happening from a political front. And I think also investors are looking at us slightly in a different lens following the appointment of the GNU, and there's a little bit more optimism. So if you do get that right, and that's going to take time because there are issues that are very, again, structural, but that also just require head-on, kind of targeting them. Things like logistics, which has actually detracted from growth. Yes, we've got one thing that's working really well around, our electricity crisis, but if the logistics sector doesn't come on force, so there's certain things, essentially I'm just trying to say there's certain things that could potentially play out to bring our growth back into close to the 2%, which need to be fixed first for us to even target anything above 2. So that is definitely going to be a consideration, and it's going to be a detriment towards businesses even going forward.